These were the scenes just 2 days after the now infamous and disastrous Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Zelensky. European leaders who had previously taken a more cautious stance gathered in droves to show their continued and unwavering support for Ukraine. The message from Europe couldn't have been clearer. With the new US administration no longer seeming to take Ukraine's or Europe's security seriously, the continent will finally break away from its decades-old policy of following Washington's leadership. Europe will no longer play the junior partner to an America not caring for its interest. Instead, it will, for the first time since World War II, chart its own independent path. One where it not only takes the lead on question of Ukraine to safeguard its sovereignty, but also one where it assumes full control of its defense and future. This is an incredibly bold shift in policy that just a few years ago, or maybe even a few months ago, would have been unthinkable, and yet here we are. So this video will explore how, in just these short 2 months, Trump has managed to push a previously hesitant Europe toward such a dramatic course of action, and ultimately what this new path could mean for the continent's future. Let's start that process right away by level setting how this situation actually came to be. What exactly is it that Trump has done? And why is it shaking the very foundations of the geopolitical order so profoundly? Well, as should be obvious from all the recent headlines and this introduction, the core of what has shaken things up has to do with the war in Ukraine. Or more specifically, the sharp shift in stance that Trump has taken toward it compared to his predecessor. You see, for the 3 years of war before Trump took office, the United States had been Ukraine's most indispensable ally for Ukraine in its fight to maintain freedom. The previous administration provided massive military and financial aid, along with invaluable intelligence that enabled Ukraine to anticipate Russian offensives and launch deep strikes into its territory, hitting critical targets like Putin's oil refineries and other key sources of war funding. In fact, this support had been so extensive that today, roughly a third of all the equipment Ukraine relies on in battle comes from America. And the United States hasn't just backed Ukraine directly, it's also taken direct action against Russia itself, hitting its economy with thousands of sanctions. And despite what many of Russia's media outlets would have you believe, when the world's strongest economy imposes relentless sanctions on you, it hurts. And now, after more than 3 years of pressure, these economic cracks have deepened into a heavy burden on Russia's war machine. So, as should be fairly easy to grasp, with all this said, US support has been crucial. Arguably the single most important factor in keeping Ukraine's war effort alive. And in turn, when you look at it from a broader picture, it's also been critical for Europe's security as well, in that it's been the key to keeping Russia in check, blocking it from securing favourable peace deals that could later embolden even more aggression against other European nations. To put the scale of US aid into perspective, according to Kiel Institute's Ukraine Support Tracker, the total allocated aid from all contributing nations stands at 267 billion euros. And of that, the United States is by far the largest donor, contributing 114 billion euros, an amount that completely dwarfs the 17 billion euros provided by the second largest contributor, Germany. Now, while this highlights the sheer scale of US support, it also perfectly explains why Trump's complete departure from this previous stance has sparked so much concern in Ukraine and across Europe. Because basically he's done a complete 180-degree turn on this policy. And a perfect example of this is what unfolded right after the heated Oval Office meeting on February 28th. Because just 3 days after that meeting, where he had already made his lack of interest in Ukraine's future clear, he ordered a full halt on all aid, cutting off not just weapons and funding, but even the sharing of critical intelligence. And while he did resume the flow of aid 8 days later, the fact that he treats it like a switch to be flipped on and off despite the stakes for millions of Ukrainians, speaks volumes. He doesn't care for the long-term security of Ukraine or Europe at all. Instead, his focus seems to be on how much he can extract from Ukraine through his mineral deal projects and how by orchestrating a peace, whether lasting or not, he can wave around an agreement and claim victory to his voters, helping him gain even more political power. Quite understandably, these developments are deeply troubling and worrying for both Kyiv and the rest of Europe. Ukraine has been heavily dependent on US support, and considering Europe has spent the past 80 years under the American defense umbrella, leaving its own military capabilities largely neglected, it's clear why they too are so worried. Furthermore, during the Oval Office meeting, Trump was directly asked about his commitment to the security of the Baltic states, 3 nations in a highly vulnerable position next to Russia.
What about the Baltics?
The Baltics, they got a lot of, it's a tough neighborhood too, but we're committed. We're going to be very committed.
And while he eventually affirmed his support, the long pause before his response, along with some questionable remarks, has only fueled doubts about whether he genuinely intends to uphold Europe's security. So, with the long-standing understanding between Europe and the United States, where Europe has played the role of a secondary partner in exchange for full protection against external threats like Russia, now looking all but broken, the question becomes, what will Europe do next? Well, the pressing question was precisely what laid at the forefront of the emergency summit that was quickly assembled following Trump's recent actions. And in a rare show of unity in European history, the 27 leaders in attendance seemed to reach a unanimous decision on what course of action to take. All 27 leaders in attendance agreed that Europe must take bold and immediate action to massively ramp up defense spending. They even laid out a detailed plan on how to implement these increases, signaling that this time it's more than just talk. And when I say these increases are massive, I mean it. The plan laid out during the summit by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen proposed mobilizing up to 800 billion euros or $873 billion for Europe's defense, calling the plan Rearm Europe. It's an enormous sum, and what this really does is demonstrate the sheer scale of the geopolitical crisis at hand. Now, what this massive surge is meant to do is to, as swiftly as possible, close the most pressing gaps left in the wake of Trump's disengagement from its security. To quote the exact European Council conclusion from this meeting, Europe must become more sovereign, more responsible for its own defense, and better equipped to act and deal autonomously with immediate and future challenges and threats with a 360-degree approach. Following this incredible announcement at the summit, several European nations also quickly unveiled their own independent initiatives aimed at strengthening the continent's security and self-reliance. The most notable of these came from Germany, which announced the lifting of its long-debated debt ceiling, an issue that has been a point of contention for years. And much like the Rearm Europe plan, the scale of this move is enormous. In practical terms, this change could free up nearly €500 billion in additional government spending, and this spending will be specifically aimed at strengthening Germany's and Europe's self-reliance and defense capabilities. Actions like these, where Germany is moving so incredibly fast on something that's been stuck in debate for years, make it pretty clear that Europe won't just talk the talk anymore, it's actually going to put its actions where its mouth is. All of what we're seeing here in Europe, with nearly every nation uniting, is something that's not been seen for a long time. And what these new European initiatives tell us is that in this make-or-break moment, Europe is clearly choosing to make. It will unite and secure not only its defense, but also its future prosperity by taking bold and impactful action. So while this crisis and split from America may have initially seemed like a nightmare for Europe, in the long run, it could actually set the continent on a far stronger trajectory. Especially when you consider what long-term effects this newfound unity and surge of independent behavior could have. Let's start with the security impact of all this. Arguably, the biggest effect here is that these spending increases across the continent, Europe will be able to step up its support for Ukraine in a way we haven't seen before. Countries will be able to send off previous stockpiles, knowing fresh equipment is on the way, and some of this new funding might even go straight to Ukraine. And this won't just help Ukraine in the obvious way, giving them what they need to push back against the Russian assaults. Rather, it will also mean that Ukraine will finally start breaking free from its dependence on the US. Eventually, to the point where no matter what Trump wants, Europe and Ukraine could be in a position to negotiate a real, lasting peace, one that actually secures Ukraine's future and, by extension, Europe's too. Now, while the security implications of this shift are huge, that's not the only thing at play, because beyond the security front, this new path is also set to have massive ripple effects for the European economy. One of the most obvious of these is that Europe's shift away from being a secondary partner to the US could help reverse some of the economic stagnation that it has faced because of it holding that exact role. You see, over the past few decades, largely from this cautious European approach of following rather than leading, its economy has fallen far behind that of other global powers like the US and China. For example, America's GDP is now over $10 trillion larger than the EU's. China's GDP is rapidly closing in too. However, as Europe starts to reverse this trend and instead adopts a more aggressive approach, taking leadership with high-risk, high-reward investments like in AI, automation, and other emerging technologies, real innovation can finally start gaining momentum. And because this has been a major weak spot for Europe, as seen in the fact that it hasn't produced a single company valued at over $100 billion since 1973, any real progress towards greater innovation will most certainly bring massive gains to the economy. On top of that, with the US becoming a less attractive investment destination and Europe growing more unified by the day, more capital is likely to stay within the continent instead of flowing overseas. This means more trade and investment will circulate within Europe, fueling reinvestment directly into its economy. And that reinvestment will drive advancements in automation, AI, and other emerging technologies, giving Europe a much-needed boost in productivity, one of its most pressing economic challenges up until now. So what all this shows is that while Trump's actions against Ukraine and Europe, along with the growing transatlantic divide, will bring short-term economic and security challenges, it's also served as a wake-up call for Europe. One that in the long run could push the continent towards greater prosperity and security. This is, of course, a hugely important and evolving topic, so let us know in the comments what you think a future Europe without US leadership will look like. Also, be sure to like and subscribe, as that's the best way to support our work and keep these deep dive analyses coming. And if you want to take it a step further, turning on notifications helps a lot too. Thanks for watching.